so I first want to start out with just deep gratitude and appreciation. What you have poured into this book, The Myth of Normal, it is a love letter for all the pain it contains. It is a love letter to the world and to us as humans. In the book, you integrate your professional experiences, your scholarship, and your hard-earned lived experience as well. It, as you see, is quite a tome, almost 600 pages.
500.
And yet it was such an easy read, so engaging. It went so quickly. I would arrive at the next chapter and be frankly shocked. And at the same time, it's very hard to read because it's personal. Because as a person with a uterus, as a parent, as a member of our society, I have experienced so much that you write about and continue to live it every day. And so it was easy to read and it was hard to read. My first question for you is pretty early on in the book, you mention that we are mostly all impacted by trauma.
Yeah.
Either large T trauma or small T trauma.
Yeah.
Would you share with us how you define trauma, what the difference is between the two, and how is it that we're all impacted?
Yes. Well, first of all, I will not hear a better acknowledgement than this bringing a love letter to the world, you know? And it just felt so right. I didn't think of it that way, but thank you for saying that. Trauma, no. It's one of these words that's both used somewhat promiscuously and inaccurately, but it's also one that's not used nearly enough where it should be used. So trauma, being a former English teacher, actually, I pay a lot of attention to the meaning of words and the word origins. And the word trauma originates from a Greek word for wound or wounding. So trauma is a wound that we've sustained, physical or psychological. Which also means immediately, it's an important distinction, that trauma is not what happened to us. Trauma is what happened inside of us, is the result of what happened to us. So trauma is not the sexual abuse. Trauma is that the person disconnects from their body as a result, because otherwise it's impossible to endure. Trauma is not the racism. Trauma is what the Black American psychologist Ken Hardy calls the assaulted sense of self, where you start seeing yourself the way the other, I just lost my mind. The way the other person sees you. So you take on another person's view of yourself. So trauma is the wound that you sustain. Now that's good news. Because if trauma was what happened to you, it'll never not have happened. If you're sexually abused as a child, that'll never not have happened. In my case, as a Jewish infant under the Nazis in Hungary in 1944, if the trauma was the death of my grandparents in Auschwitz, or the fact that my mother, to save my life, gave me to a complete stranger in the street and I didn't see her for 6 weeks, if that was the trauma, that will never not have happened. But if the trauma is the dim view of the world that I developed as a result, if trauma is the self-belief that since I was rejected, abandoned by my mother, I'm not lovable, if that's a trauma, that can be healed at any time. So this view of trauma is not what happened to you, but what happened inside you, first of all, is essential. Secondly, if you look at the nature of a wound, if we're going with the wound analogy, well, what is a wound like? Well, if it's very raw and open, if you touch it, it just hurts. And it's in the nature of traumatic memory that you just touch the spot, even lightly, something that not even resembling in intensity the original injury, but it just reminds you of it. You react as if you're being hurt all over again. That's, by the way, is what you call being triggered. The other, being a physician then, the other thing I know about wounds is that they scar over. So we have scar tissue. What's the nature of scar tissue? First of all, it's hard. It has no nerve endings in it, so it doesn't feel. So trauma implies that traumatized people tend not to feel their genuine emotions because it was, again, too painful to feel them in the first place. That has all kinds of implications for physical and mental health later on and relationships. Scar tissue is rigid, it's inflexible. So people traumatized, to the degree that they're traumatized, their responses tend to be rigid and inflexible and stereotypical. And that's what Peter Levine, the trauma psychologist, calls the tyranny of the past, that we react to the present as if we're still living in the past. And finally, scar tissue doesn't grow. It's fixed. And people who are traumatized tend to be stuck at the level of development they were at when they were traumatized. So if a certain wound of mine is touched, I'll respond like a 1-year-old being abandoned, as my wife could tell you. So these are all the aspects of trauma. The essence of trauma, however, is the disconnection from ourselves, from our bodies, and from our genuine emotions. I'll just say finally that it doesn't take terrible events to traumatize a child. I mean, there are plenty of terrible events that happen to children in this society, as we know. But people can be wounded in 2 ways, particularly sensitive young children can be wounded in 2 ways. One is if you do bad things to them, but you can also wound them by not providing for their emotional needs. So in this society, for all kinds of reasons we could talk about, a lot of children are wounded not because they were overtly abused, but simply because their essential developmental needs were unmet. And that's wounding to a child. That's the distinction that sometimes we make between the big T traumas of the abuse and the neglect and the violence in the family, or a parent being jailed, or a parent dying, or a parent being addicted. That's the big T stuff. Or a war. That's the big T stuff. The small T traumas are more those developmental incidents where a child wasn't seen, wasn't heard, wasn't accepted for who they were, where their emotional needs were not satisfied. That's a small T trauma, which can be just as devastating to a lot of people, especially if they're very sensitive, but which are more difficult to see because we take them for granted.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And as people hear you speak, as they read your book, and they identify with the experiences that you're writing about, that you're speaking about, what are some ways that individuals and families can engage wellness while we continue to live in a society that inspires illness?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many ways in which, again, we could talk about them, in which this particular society, let me give you an analogy from the introduction. So if you're a laboratory scientist and you're growing microorganisms in a petri dish, you'd put them in a broth. We call that broth a culture. And if those microorganisms were growing well and proliferating as accepted, that's a healthy, nourishing culture. But as Tom Hartman points out, a culture could be nourishing or toxic. My contention is that we live in a toxic culture. Human beings, we're like in a large petri dish that's not serving our needs, in fact, which is even venomous in its impact on a lot of human beings. So then your question is how to regain or maintain health in a culture that fundamentally doesn't support it. Mm-hmm. It's hard. And I don't know that I have any easy answers. And of course, what we have to keep in mind as well is that the toxicities of this culture, although they spare no social class and no strata, no matter what degree of power or attainment, they certainly don't fall equally across the population. And so that if you look at the physiological impacts of what I call this toxic culture, you can look at the biological markers of aging, for example, of Caucasians versus people of color. You're going to find people of color under much more physiological stress and with biomarkers of ill health, which have nothing to do with genetics, nothing to do with inheritance, has everything to do with the pressures of a toxic culture. So how do you maintain or regain health? Well, the first step at least is to recognize that how we're living is not normal, that what we think is the norm is actually completely abnormal when it comes to human needs and human, the necessities of human development, number one. On an individual level, it's not to believe the programming. We may think that we live in this free society and individuals, we're programmed. We're not programmed quite as determinedly as maybe in the people in Huxley's Brave New World, where people actually gestate in a test tube and they're prepared for certain social roles, but almost. So we have to, first of all, not believe the programming. We also have to recognize the signs of trauma in ourselves and not mistake them for our personalities. Because what we call the personality is very often, in fact, an amalgam of some genuine qualities that we might have, but with a huge dollop of adaptations to traumatic situations. So that if you're one of these people, just to give an example of somebody who's very nice and always thinking of others ahead of yourself, you're much more likely to develop autoimmune disease. And we can talk about why. There's a physiological connection between our psychology, not a connection. Our psychology is inseparable from our physiology. Actually, scientifically, it's one thing. So usually what happens is that somebody has to suffer. I wish it wasn't that way, but it's just the way it seems to be. But when they're suffering, rather than believe that there's something wrong with us fundamentally, let's ask, what happened to us? And how did what happened to me dominate the way I show up in the world, the choices that I make, the relationships that I form, the habits that I pursue? In other words, you have to begin with a compassionate inquiry into what makes you tick the way you tick. It's got to start with that questioning and just not assuming that I am this way and this is my true nature. Most of the way most of us show up in a society in a very artificial, consumerist, elite-dominated society has nothing to do with our true nature. In fact, it's inimical to our true nature. That's why we suffer. If it was our true nature, we wouldn't be suffering. So it's got to be with that. Got to begin with that recognition that it ain't necessarily so, to quote from Porgy and Bess. It ain't necessarily so. We don't necessarily have to be this way.
It reminds me in your book, you talk about a retreat with traditional healers and the importance of ceremony.
Yeah.
You also talk about as healers came from across the world to come to this healing retreat.
Yeah.
The traditional healers in Peru were astounded at in what rough shape people were showing up in.
Yeah.
And you talk about how people had absorbed so much pain from the work that they do.
Well, the story is even more dramatic than that, because what happened was that for the last 12 years or so, I've been working with psychedelics, not exclusively, and it's actually a small part of what I do, but I do find it very interesting and powerful modality of healing. So I've been working particularly with the Peruvian or Amazonian plant called ayahuasca. And so 3 years ago, just a month before I began working on this book, I arrived in Peru to lead a retreat for health professionals from around the world who'd read my books, who'd know my work, so they came to work under my leadership with this plant. Now, when I say my leadership, I'm not a shaman. I don't offer the brew or lead ceremony, but I help people formulate their intentions and to help them integrate the experience afterwards. So these shamans who are not impressed with me because they know nothing about me, or maybe they were not impressed because they knew everything about me, one or the other, we do one ceremony, and in the morning they come to me and said, we can't have you in ceremony. because we find that you have too dark and dense energy about you that doesn't let our chants penetrate. And furthermore, your denseness and darkness is affecting the other people in the room, so you can't work with them even during the day. Essentially, they fired me from my own retreat. And they said, one of us will work with you by yourself. You'll have your own private ceremony because we need to heal you, buddy. They said that there's two reasons why you seem so dense. By dense, they did not mean intellectually. I hope. They meant energetically. We think that you've been working with a lot of traumatized people over the years. You've been absorbing their traumas, and you haven't cleared it out of yourself. Number one. Number two, would you mind handing me that book, sir? Thank you. The first chapter of the book opens with a painting by my wife, which you won't see, but what it has is me, based on a photograph of me at 3 months of age. This is my mother holding me. The photograph is up in the left-hand corner. My wife, being an artist, she did this painting. My mother's wearing the yellow star that Jews had to wear under the Nazis. And if you look in my eyes, you see pure terror. And a physician that saw me in my infancy actually said that I've never seen such fear in the eyes of anyone as in that infant. You know what the shaman said to me, knowing nothing about my history? They said, we think that when at the beginning of your life you had a big scare and you haven't got over it yet. So they worked on that. This shaman worked on that for 10 nights over 5 ceremonies. But they also said at the end of the, thank you very much, they also said at the end of the retreat that when we heard that these people that came to work with me were all psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, social workers, physicians, therapists, 23 of them from 4 continents. But the shaman said at the end that when they heard that all these healthcare workers were coming to work with us, we thought we'd have an easy job. Because we, as shamans, also work with trauma, but we make sure that we clear it out of each other and ourselves afterwards. So we expected that you people would have done the same. They said, we've never worked with such a heavy bunch in our whole lives, which says something about the way we practice medicine and healing, and I would say social work as well in this culture. We're working with all these traumatized people, and by the way, whether you know it or not, every single person you'll ever deal with is traumatized, including yourself. But they said, we expected that you will have done the same. We've never worked with such a heavy bunch. Now, I understand that in this training here, maybe there's some degree of self-awareness that's taught, or at least recommended or introduced. But for the most part, we train healthcare workers to know nothing about self-care. And then there's this huge burnout rate, partly because we're dealing with all these traumatized people, absorbing their stresses and not even recognizing it. So this is what these shamans picked up in one night with me, without talking to me, without knowing anything about my history.
So we have many healers in the room, current and future healers. And even if you aren't in direct practice, if you're doing community organizing, if you're doing that macro level work, you are still engaged in healing work. So what wisdom would you share with us around burnout, around secondary trauma, so we don't show up at the retreat and we're a mess?
Yeah. Well, when I teach people in this compassionate inquiry program for therapists and healers and doctors and so on, they think they're coming to learn a method, but actually the first 3 months is spent on their own, exploring themselves. So I think that the self-work is just the most important aspect of entering into any of the healing professions. It's as important as any training you're ever going to get. It's just to work on yourself. Otherwise, you can't help but absorb other people's traumas. And otherwise, and there's a reason, by the way, because the people that tend to go into the helping professions, there's a reason why they go into it. Which you can talk about that too, but it's not accidental. And they tend to be people who will put other people's needs ahead of their own. So, and they're programmed that way by their own childhoods, which is why they go into the helping professions. One of the reasons, not the only reason. I mean, whatever we do usually has multiple reasons. There's the conscious reasons. I want to help humanity. I like people. Those are all valid, good reasons. But there's also a fair bit of, I have to justify my existence. I have to be important in people's lives because I wasn't made to feel important as a child. Or because I learned that how I survived my childhood is to be a helper to others, and that's the only way I know how to be. To the extent that we're driven by those unconscious forces, you're going to burn out because you won't know where to set a boundary. So you got to get to know yourself. And not only do you have to get to know yourself at the outset of this journey of becoming a healer, but you have to keep it up throughout, because there's so many pressures and even rewards for ignoring yourself. I mean, the more I ignored myself as a workaholic physician, the more rewards I got. The more I ignored my family, the more rewards I got. My wife would go into a supermarket or a bank and somebody would see the credit card and say, "Oh my God, are you the wife of?" And she'd say, "Yeah," gritting her teeth. Because the wonderful Dr. Maté, who was there for all their patients, was not there for his family or for himself, because he was driven. So to the extent that you're driven by these unconscious forces, you're going to burn out or cause distress to the people close to you. So you got to work on yourself at the beginning and throughout. And you got to clear these traumatized energies that you can't help but absorb some of them out of yourself. Well, that takes some kind of practice, taking care of the body, taking care of the mind, taking care of the soul, taking care of how you eat, taking care of probably some mindfulness practice in your life, some yoga, some connection with nature, but some regular conscious practice to clear it.
I love how you talk about the importance of reflection and self-reflection. And it reminds me, just this week, I had a previous student reach out and say, I wondered why, when I got my master's at the Crown Family School, there were so many assignments that were reflections, and now I get it. It's all of this is using myself in the work. That's why we have so many reflections. And in your book, you outline some different questions to meditate on and journal about. Would you share any of those with us now?
Well, yeah, speaking of this compulsive urge to help, where you don't say no. You just keep taking it on. So one particular exercise is, and by the way, one of my previous books, it's called When the Body Says No, and my contention, and not just my contention, but a whole lot of evidence also points out that when you don't know how to say no, your body will say it for you, from some kind of illness. And most chronic illnesses, autoimmune diseases and malignancies, most, I say not all, I don't say they're caused by, but they have a huge contribution to their onset by people's difficulty saying no and taking on too much stress. Because stress, when you take on too much, stress isn't just a psychological event. It affects your physiology. By definition, it's a physiological event. So it's not a big mystery about how not saying no would lead to illness. So the exercise has to do with, where in my life have I trouble saying no? In other words, where there's a no that wants to be said, but you don't say it. And that usually shows up in two areas. One is in personal life, the other is in work. So where in my life do I have trouble saying no? Where there's a no that really wants to be said, but I don't say it. Now, it's not accidental. There's this big mystery in medical thinking about why is it that 70 or 80% of people with autoimmune disease are women? It's very simple why it's women. Because women in this culture are acculturated to absorb the stresses of their men and their whole families. So during COVID, the New York Times had an article entitled "Society's Shock Absorbers," about how women took on the responsibility of reducing the stress of their children and of their spouses, and they felt guilty when they couldn't. Now, that's a culturally determined role. So they have trouble saying no to other people's needs at their own expense. Their body says no in the form of autoimmune illness. It's really almost that simple. And there's all kinds of physiological pathways that lead that from the difficulty saying no to the illness, but I'm just telling you that's how it works. So this little question of saying no is not just a trivial question. So the first question is, where in my life do I have trouble saying no? This is an exercise you can do once a week. In fact, I recommend that you do it. It's outlined in the book. The second question then is, what is the impact of my difficulty saying no? Well, the impact's going to be fatigue, poor sleep, dry mouth, anxiety, back spasms, intestinal upsets, digestive problems, rashes, frequent colds, or worse. On the physiological level. On the emotional level, it's going to be resentment. Then the third question is, what is the belief that gives me the difficulty saying no? Well, the belief is usually if I say no, I'm guilty. If I say no, I'm selfish. If I say no, they won't like me. If I say no, I'm letting other people down. Which are stories that you developed in childhood. They're not an accurate reflection of reality. How do I know it's not an accurate reflection of reality? Because those of you that are parents, what is the word that your kids start saying compulsively at age 1.5? No. No, nature is not stupid. We are stupid. You know? Because when the kids start saying no, we call that the terrible twos. There's nothing terrible about it. There's a reason why the kids start saying no. Why don't they start saying yes? Hey, Phyllis, it's time for dinner. Yes. Time to put your shoes on. Yes. No, they say no. A friend of mine, actually, when I was a medical resident, intern, a fellow resident of mine called Harold had a son called Ben. Ben was 2 years old, and Harold said to Ben once, "Ben, do you want an apple?" And Ben said, "No, I want an apple." You know. Now, what that's about is nature's wisdom. The child's agenda, or nature's agenda, is to become an independent, self-directed person with their own will. And how do we ever develop a will of our own in the face of the power and size and sheer dominance of our parents? By saying no first. And then behind that little ball of no's, we can develop our own little will. So that no is an important dynamic, because if you don't know how to say no, your yeses don't mean anything at all. If I said to you, "Gabriela, do you love me?" and you had no idea of saying no, your yes would not mean a thing, would it? You know. So, but in childhood, in order to fit in with our families, and this is what I call the tension between authenticity and attachment. In order to belong, I have to suppress my authenticity. We forget, or we don't know how to say no, that we knew how to say when we were 1.5. And that has significant implications. So these beliefs around not saying no are simply childhood programming that has nothing to do with our true nature. So I could go on. There's 3 more steps to this exercise, but you just begin a self-inquiry. If you just do that once a week alone, that'll go a long way towards helping you take care of yourself.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, trauma, big T, little t, is impacting us individually and families as a whole, on all these different levels, in ways that we have yet to become aware of. Is there any good that comes from trauma? And not that anything justifies trauma, But given that trauma is here, is there any good that can come from it?
So I would frame the question not as does it come out of it, but can it come out of it? Not necessarily. Sometimes just if people's lives are utterly destroyed. Some of you may have seen a film that's made about my work. If you haven't, it's freely available online. It's called The Wisdom of Trauma. www.thewisdomoftrauma.com. The Wisdom of Trauma. So what do we mean by the wisdom of trauma? It's been seen by about 8 million people internationally. And there's a wisdom of in trauma. And in two ways, and one of them pertains to your question. The first wisdom in trauma is that, you know, I talked about that disconnect as being the essence of trauma, but there's a wisdom in that disconnect. Because the child who's being abused or just is suffering, the disconnection is a way of not experiencing the suffering that otherwise they couldn't endure. So even in that traumatic disconnect, there's a wisdom. Trouble is, that same disconnect, it becomes a sort of physical and mental pathology later on. And by the way, if you're going to work with mental health conditions, as many of you are, I'll just give you the statement of Dr. Richard Bentall, a psychologist, member of the British Academy, who said that the link between adult mental health conditions and childhood adversity is about as strong as the link between smoking and smoking and lung cancer. So it's not even controversial, except in psychiatry, where people still haven't heard about it. But for the most part, that's a whole other conversation. So there's the wisdom in the original, or let's say something like depression. Let me give you a couple of examples. So I've been diagnosed both with depression and ADHD. And, you know, these are genetic, inherited, biological diseases. No, they're not. They're adaptations, for God's sakes. What does it mean to depress something? It means to push it down. What do we push down when we're depressed? We push down our emotions. Why do we push down our emotions? Because our environment cannot handle our emotions, and to belong and fit in with our environment, we have to push them down. This is the young child's survival technique, not conscious. It's the organism's wisdom. If my parents can't handle my anger, I better push it down, better depress it, and then 25 years later, you're diagnosed with this disease called depression. ADD, my first book was about ADD after I was diagnosed. So were a couple of my kids. But I never bought into the idea that this is a genetic disease, either that it's genetic or that it's a disease. Because what is tuning out, which is the hallmark of ADD? It's a coping mechanism. You can imagine, under the conditions of my first year of life, as I've briefly described them, it was very stressful to be an infant. What does an infant do? Can I escape, change the situation? You tune out. But when do you tune out? When your brain is developing and your brain circuits are being formed. So that gets programmed into your brain. Then you're diagnosed with this so-called genetic disease. It's a coping mechanism. So there's a wisdom in the trauma in the first place. But then secondly, in learning about the trauma, in learning about yourself, you just learn so much about life. You learn so much about other people, about the true nature of existence, about your own true nature. So yeah, something, and you know, in the book, I mean, this may be surprising to some of you, but I used to work in palliative care as well. And sometimes a dying person would say to me, I don't recommend this, by the way, but they would say to me, Doc, this disease is the best thing that ever happened to me. And what do you imagine they were talking about? They were talking about the fact that the disease became their teacher, that they learned through dealing with the illness how alienated and disconnected from themselves they had become. And in that process of coming to terms with that, they reconnected with themselves, and that was more precious to them than survival. Now, I don't recommend that way of learning. There's a chapter in a book called Diseases, Dreadful Gift, Diseases Teacher. But even trauma that results in serious illness can be a teacher to you if you're willing to learn and if you have some guidance about how to learn from it. The problem is that in this society we don't understand those connections, so we just look upon everything as a problem to get rid of, rather than to learn from. What, for example, if a society we actually learned from COVID? We could actually learn. I mean, for God's sakes, didn't we just learn how important human connections are? How much nonsense this capitalist view of human beings as aggressive, individualistic, selfish, greedy creatures by nature, how alien that is to our true nature. Couldn't we have just learned that? Couldn't we have also finally learned the scientific fact that's been documented for decades, that inequality and racism kills? Because who are the people more prone to contract COVID? Were people under economic and psychological pressure, and of course people of color. Is it an accident that in my country, Canada, an indigenous woman has 6 times the rate of rheumatoid arthritis than that of anybody else? This is in a population that never used to have rheumatoid arthritis. Didn't COVID give us an opportunity to finally learn these lessons that we've been resisting? And you know, for a while in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder and then of these COVID facts, there was some attention paid in the media to these obvious facts. Nothing changed. So we could learn from trauma, but we have to be willing to learn.
Yeah. This, what this brings to mind for me is the importance of presence, presence in our embodiment and in our moment, and the importance of acceptance.
So one of the impacts of trauma is that it cuts us off from the present moment. Because we're always reacting to the past. We don't know that, but we are. Or we're programmed by the past. So then we lose the present moment. So, you know, there are spiritual teachers who focus very eloquently and very deeply on, you know, the power of now, Eckhart Tolle, who also lives in Vancouver, British Columbia. So the presence is really important, but it's not immediately available to us without consciousness, without conscious awareness. It's very easy for us. I mean, look at your mind, how much of the time it dwells on the past, what should have happened or what didn't happen, or what did happen, what you hope will happen, what you're afraid will happen. How often are we actually present? Even when you're talking to somebody. How present are you to who you're talking to? You know, their being and their awareness and their responses to you. We tend to get lost in our minds, which is past and future oriented. So now I'm far from a shining example of somebody who embodies presence, but certainly that's the goal. Acceptance, that's an interesting and an important word. It does not mean tolerance. It does not mean putting up with. It means accepting that things are the way they are at this moment, and they're not any other way. And people have a hard time with that. Denial, which is so rife in society, is actually an absolute rejection of acceptance. Because you have to, if you're going to accept things, you're going to have to accept a lot of very painful things. So acceptance may be painful. Again, acceptance does not mean that therefore it has to be the way it is, or I'm going to put up with it the way it is, and I'm going to tolerate it. That's not acceptance. That's giving up. But acceptance means this is how it is, and I'm not going to reject my awareness of how it is, because I want to be in the present, I want to move forward. And I can only do that if I get how it is, if I accept how it is for now. All the better, so I can do something about it.
So now I have a question for you that may seem silly, but I want you to bear with me.
Oh, I'll try.
So you've shared with us the understanding of trauma is disconnection on so many levels, and that how incredibly needed it is for us to have that authentic connection to ourselves, to others, to nature, to the earth. And, you know, I read your book. I have the print copy, the ebook, and the audiobook narrated by your son, Daniel. So I have all versions possible. And I didn't find any mention of our furry family members. I didn't find any mention of pets. So I wonder if you would share with us your thoughts about the potential role of our non-human animal family members in connection and healing.
I knew I would fail somewhere, and didn't. You know, in the Soviet Union after the Second World War, there was a real Stalinist terror against artists. You don't know why I'm saying this, but I'll tell you in a minute. And musicians, like great composers like Prokofiev and Shostakovich and others, were forever criticized because they didn't reflect the party line. And one particular Soviet composer, and then you have to do self-criticism, of course, because the party can't be wrong, so you must have been wrong. Mm-hmm. So this one particular Soviet composer writes this self-critique. I don't understand how could I have failed to introduce a Russian folk song into my latest opera, So in the same sense, I don't understand how I could have failed to mention pets in my latest book, Having said that, it's a great question. So let me give you two answers. One is I've just written a foreword for a new book. Not my book, but for a psychologist, Darcia Narvaez, who used to teach at Notre Dame University, and I quote her quite a bit in this book. And the book is called The Evolved Nest, and she shows how parenting practices of all mammals are so similar, and that the way we parent is so out of sync between with our true nature. So we could actually learn from animals about how to parent. For example, I just love this story. It's called The Evolved Nest. It's going to come out next year. It's a beautiful, beautiful short book. Wonderful book. And Darcia and her co-writer, they talk about how elephants give birth. You know how an elephant gives birth? When an elephant mother goes into labor, all the other mother elephants stand around in a circle. And when the young one hits the ground, they all reach up with their trunks and they stroke the infant. It's a communal event. We have so much to learn from animals. Now, when it comes to pets, I'll tell you about one study, which is not in the book, but I'm sorry, that you mentioned it, that I didn't put it in. They looked at a group of cardiac patients, coronary heart disease, hospitalized, who all were at the same stage of illness. They all received the same medical treatment, but they divided them into three groups. One group, the control group, had no special intervention. They just got the medical treatment. Another group had human visitors, human volunteers visiting them. And the third group had dogs visiting them. At the end of a month, guess which group was the healthiest? The dog group. And that's because our pets connect to us directly through the limbic system, to the emotional apparatus. So any of you who've worked with horses or dogs, you know that they just get you emotionally without any filter of trauma or misinterpretation or egoic demands. They just are with you. So, your question is right on point.
Yeah.
Although I'm wondering where you came up with that question. Where did that come from?
Well, from my own life.
I see.
Knowing that my non-human family members are so cherished, and that non-human animal connection is so incredibly deep, and has been a source of healing for me many times in my life.
But you'd love this book because what they do in this book, they don't talk about animals with a small a, they talk about animals with a capital A. Mm-hmm. And they don't talk about beavers with a small b, they talk about beavers with a capital B, like they're family members. Mm-hmm. You'd love that book.
Mm-hmm. I'm definitely going to check it out.
Yeah.
So, thinking about the petri dish we're all in, and how the conditions, by and large, are not present for our healthy development from in utero, right? Those conditions are not met at this time. Are there cultures, past or present, that you have had knowledge of or contact with that get a little closer, get some of it a little more right than ours?
Well, yes, although they're increasingly undergoing extinction. When you actually study the question, what you find is the people living in hunter-gatherer groups, in small band hunter-gatherer groups, somewhere in the rainforest, they do a whole lot better than we do in terms of child raising, in terms of human relationships, in terms of life satisfaction, in terms of connection to the earth and to nature and so on. Civilization, we have to understand, like we evolved over millions of years, didn't we? And is it legal to mention evolution in Illinois these days? You never know with this. But I'm sorry, I'm joking. In the States, you never know these days. So we evolved over millions of years, and hominins or human-like creatures have existed for millions of years, and our own species, they were pre-sapiens humans on Earth for hundreds of thousands of years, and evolution prepared us. I mean, it's not that we all of a sudden landed on Earth and adapted to it. We developed as a product of the Earth. We developed as a product of evolution. And therefore our nature was determined by our evolutionary needs. Mm-hmm. So there's a wonderful book called The Continuum Concept by Jane Lidloff, written in the 60s, I think, and she stayed with this tribe in the Amazon, and she talks about how the human child, it's not that the human child has expectations, but is an expectation. Like the lung is an expectation for oxygen. The lung doesn't expect oxygen. The lung is an expectation for oxygen. The lung evolved in response to oxygen. Had there been no oxygen, there'd be no lung. So we are expectations for certain conditions. Civilization, so we lived that way for hundreds of thousands of years. Even in the existence of our own species, Homo sapiens sapien, we've been on Earth, 150,000 years? 200,000 years? If even just the existence of our own species, never mind our ancestors, just the existence of our own species can be measured in an hour, then civilization is about 6 minutes. So as soon as what we call civilization, by the way, you've heard Gandhi's famous quip, haven't you, about Western civilization? When Gandhi was asked about, what do you think about Western civilization? He said, I think it would be a good idea. But in any case, what we call civilization is like 5 or 6 minutes in our existence. So as soon as you get civilization and the accumulation of wealth and division into classes, and then the breakage of the matriarchy and the rise of the patriarchy, you start getting more and more problems. What corporate capitalism has done is taken those problems to the nth degree. So are there societies in this world, apart from these very isolated groupings that are increasingly, like in the Brazilian Amazon, they're being exterminated because, of course, you have to cut down the forest for agro-business. There's some people who get it much more right. Like if you go to Finnish schools, for example, it's all about play. It's not all about forcing kids to learn the curriculum. As a result, they have the most literate culture on earth because they play a lot more. There was an article in The Guardian just the other day about how, in some aspects, the United States is like so low on the life satisfaction scale compared to other countries, including a country like, say, Cuba, that is the arch enemy here, not to the people, but of course the political ideology. So some people, no, not that that's a perfect society. They get a lot of things wrong that we don't want here. But so all I'm saying is that in some aspects, some societies get it more right. But I can't point to a single culture that says, oh yeah, well they've got it. They haven't. I think we're still in evolution is what it is. And we're lurching towards something. And it's not accidental that my work has gained quite a bit of recognition. Today, even as we're speaking today, my colleague and mentor and friend Bessel van der Kolk is in town. In his book, The Body Keeps the Score, has been a New York Times bestseller for the last, I don't know how many, several years, on trauma. It's a dense book on trauma, but it's a bestseller. What does that tell you? It means that the more society lurches towards crisis, the more people want to wake up. And just the gratifying response to my book, which has only been out for a week, but it's already got tremendous response. It indicates that people want to learn, they want to wake up, they want to grow up, they want to move beyond where we're at. So it's not so much that I can point to any one particular society that's really got it. What I can point to is that inner drive on the part of people to actually move past our present morass. That's where I see the hope, not in here's the model that we should follow, but what is the process inside of us, socially and individually, that needs to come to fruition.
Thank you.